Hi, I'm Matt Stoller, author of monopoly-focused newsletter Big, and an antitrust policy analyst. I have a great segment for you today on this big breakdown. Yes, today we're going to talk about the baby formula fiasco, what's going on with it, and what it says about the American economy. As you'll learn, it's not just baby formula in shortage, and the shortages across the economy have a common root. Okay, so let's start with the basics. A few months ago, Abbott Labs, which is the largest producer of baby formula in the United States, had to shut down its main production facilities in Sturgis, Michigan, because they had become contaminated with deadly bacteria. The FDA forced the shutdown after 2 babies died and 2 others were injured who had drank the formula. Now, the company, in another firm called Mead Johnson, control about 80% of the formula market in the United States. So now, with the biggest player essentially off the market, there's a shortage. Now, obviously, the situation is a nightmare for parents, especially for those whose children require special kinds of formula because of gastrointestinal issues or food allergies. Babies are being brought to hospitals so they get food, and just to get food, and some are even having to get feeding tubes if they have problems with the only formula available to them. It's just horrible. So let's talk about the root of the issue, and to do that, we have to start with the firm at the center of the problem, Abbott Labs. Now, Abbott is a huge and profitable firm. It owns lots of different divisions, from infant nutrition to medical supplies to pharmaceuticals. And like a lot of huge companies, this is a $200 billion company, it does a lot of financial games. So share buybacks, dividends, tons of mergers. Domestic baby formula is actually a relatively small part of its bottom line, less than 5% of its revenue. So if that part fails, it doesn't really matter that much to the CEO. That's not a rounding error on the revenue, but it is pretty close. Now, here's a headline from Barron's, which is a financial magazine, making the point a bit too finely. Baby formula shortages are bad for parents. They could be good for Abbott stock. Ouch. Now, it's not just that Abbott is a massive conglomerate that cares more about profits than actually producing the products that people rely on. You'd think that after this fiasco, a baby formula company that can't deliver baby formula, that it would be chased out of the market by angry parents and stores that couldn't get stuff on the shelves. But here's the thing. Even though Abbott failed spectacularly, it will still maintain, in all likelihood, a huge market share in the baby formula market after its factory comes back online. Why? Well, the answer is monopoly power. And to get into how it maintains its monopoly power, we have to look at how this highly consolidated industry of baby formula works. So let's do that. The biggest buyer of infant formula in the United States is WIC, which is a government program called the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. It's a program run by the Department of Agriculture to make sure that low-income women can feed their babies. Roughly half of women get their formula from WIC, and that makes the government a very, very big buyer in the market, which is sometimes called a power buyer. The government in this case is a bit like Amazon or Walmart. It's so powerful, it buys so much that it can dictate terms to sellers, since the only way to get your product to customers is to go through that power buyer. Now, the government structures the market state by state. Each state gives a monopoly contract to just one formula producer in return for better pricing in the form of rebates. That's how the WIC program handles its purchasing. The government is explicit about this, saying it is handing out quote-unquote sole source contracts that allow, they only allow women or people who have children to buy formula from one company in most states. Now, this sole source system distorts the entire market, because if you're a retailer, if you sell baby formula, it's just not worth having alternative formulas on your shelf if half of the buyers simply cannot purchase those products. As a result, the market in every state tips to the WIC supplier. This chart shows what happens to the baby formula market in California when the WIC contract changed hands. So one monopoly provider hands off nearly the entire market to another. And these contracts are long-term. They're 4-year contracts. So this is a pretty solid market power situation we're talking about. Now, all of this is fine if you're getting your formula for free from the government, as long as the formula keeps flowing, which we'll talk about in a second. But here's the trick. the formula producer can raise its price on non-WIC recipients, and they do that. One study showed that to non-WIC recipients, they get formula for a higher price, at about 26 to 35% cost higher than it would be if there weren't these WIC subsidies in the market. This is called a spillover effect. One formula maker gets to control all the shelf space. They raise the prices on people that are not subsidized by the government. Now, that spillover effect is why it makes sense for a formula maker to give a low price to the government. They make it up elsewhere. Okay, now let's go back to the shortage. Reporter Helena Bodemiller-Evich, who has been all over this scandal, pointed out a few weeks ago that we really don't have kind of a national problem with enough formula. This is sort of the basic formula. What she said was, the average in-stock rate is currently about 79% across the US, far below the pre-pandemic norms of 95%, but not critically low. The shortage, in other words, isn't just or even primarily a production problem. It's a regional distribution problem. Now, this is oversimplifying. There are certain specialty formulas that the Sturgis plant really was the sole source producer for, and those are the shortage there is really critical. But broadly speaking, when you can't get formula on the shelves, it's more of a regional distribution problem. Now, there are shortages in specific states like Tennessee and Missouri, because these are Abbott states. Abbott has contracts that let the firm control the market in those states. So it's hard to move formula into Abbott states, even if non-Abbott formula is available elsewhere. All the infrastructure, all the bureaucracy is set up for that particular formula producer. Now, certainly this program, this WIC program, the specific way that it buys formula keeps players out of the market. Here's Congresswoman Ann Kuster asking Scott Fitz from the Gerber Products Division at Nestle, which is a small player in our market, whether they would compete if this WIC purchasing system operated differently. Let's take a listen. This back and forth really gets to the heart of the monopoly distribution problem.
Thank you. Would it change your business plans generally overall? And this is hypothetical, but I think it's something we need to consider. If the WIC, Women, Infants, and Children formula was not sole source, but if you could participate in that program, would that make a difference in your business model?
Well, I can tell you again, a small player in the US market, it's difficult for us to compete against two larger competitors.
And if you had a larger potential market, would you see growth in Gerber production of baby formula?
As you're probably aware, Nestle is a large manufacturer of infant formula globally, and if we saw the market opportunity here, I'm sure we would invest to satisfy that opportunity.
So there we go. The WIC program, with the government as a power buyer, is keeping players, even globally really big players like Nestle, out of our markets. That reduces resiliency, increases concentration. Okay, but it's not all a distribution problem. There is still the factory shutdown, which sparked the whole problem, sparked the whole crisis. And that brings us to the regulator, the Food and Drug Administration. Now, the FDA has a mandate. They're supposed to ensure that baby formula doesn't harm your baby, right? It's not really their job to make sure that baby formula is either cheap or available. They just have to make sure it's safe. Whether that's a good mandate or not, that's the way that they think about their job. The FDA makes it really hard to get into the industry. Okay, so let's give you an example. As a regulator, this is what they do to new entrants. There's a company called Bobby, which makes European-style formula. Now, Bobby is the first firm to come into the market in 5 years. It was a rough road getting started. The firm faced a recall and a shutdown purely for manufacturing in Germany, and it had to go through millions of dollars of capital and a steep learning curve to get its product accepted by the FDA. Now, that seems kind of nuts, right? I mean, it's a consolidated market, and here's a new entrant. Isn't that good? Wouldn't you want that? Yes, but there's a reason the FDA is skeptical. In the 1970s, baby formulas without adequate nutrition led to weight loss and lifelong brain damage for hundreds of babies. So Congress passed a law with very specific standards on what nutrients need to be in formula. That's why the FDA makes it very hard for new players. There's zero incentive for regulators to let new firms into the baby formula market when, in their view, there are already excellent quality companies serving the market, such as Abbott Labs and Mead Johnson. Now, this was, of course, short-sighted. Baby formula is twice as expensive in the US as in Europe. But like the shortage, that's not the FDA's problem. Well, that's the way that they think about it. Another issue is that the FDA, while really hard on new players, is too deferential to incumbents. Baby formula made by the big guys in the US is full of dangerous, brain-altering heavy metals. One organization called Healthy Babies, Healthy Futures tested 13 different baby formulas, and every single one had detectable levels of arsenic, cadmium, lead, and/or mercury. This is bad for your brain. It's really bad for newborns' brains who are developing very quickly. So there are huge problems at the FDA, such as underfunding, a lack of authority to compel data from firms it regulates, and a general sense of powerlessness among regulators. There's also institutional problems. At the FDA, the medical part is cool. The food stuff, not so much. So the medical people kind of run the show, and they give short shrift to things, to food, and infant formula is actually a food. But really, the FDA isn't the primary villain here. In September of last year, the FDA inspected Abbott's Sturgis factory, and they found it had old and dirty equipment, leaky water towers, employees wore dirty shoes in environments that were supposed to be sterile, and the FDA actually told Abbott to fix these problems, but the firm did not. Instead, Abbott falsified records, deceived regulators, had bad product tracing, and did not fix problems after discovery. A whistleblower went to the FDA in October. The FDA didn't really bother to even interview that whistleblower until December. But the next month, from January to March, the FDA did investigate again, and they found 310 documented water leaks that could have allowed bacteria to grow into the formula. The equipment that turns liquid into powder, spray dryers, which is a critical step for baby formula, had apparently been deteriorating since 2018. So this problem is longstanding. The FDA also found that when Abbott got complaints, they didn't investigate, or if they did, they closed the investigation without finding a root cause for the reported illness associated with bacterial infection. The FDA, when they shut down the factory, they knew there would be a shortage, but they shut it down anyway to force Abbott to clean it up. That's really the only authority that they had. What else could they do when Abbott refused to clean up their factory, and the only choice they had was to either close the factory or let Abbott continue to produce at clearly what was a substandard facility? Now, from Abbott's perspective, because they have an argument on this, they claim that the strain of bacteria that killed those babies wasn't specifically traced back to their factory, and that is true. None of the 5 strains found at the factory were in the cans of food that the babies ate. But that might be because no one was really looking when that particular baby formula was produced and distributed, and the FDA couldn't compel Abbott to hand over samples or data. Remember, Abbott wasn't investigating when it got complaints, and the FDA only inspected a few different times, largely relying on Abbott's own records. So it's likely there were hundreds of different types of that bacteria, but no one was collecting evidence or samples at the time, and it's obviously too late now. Now, the company is clearly in big trouble, violated a host of different laws, and even Nancy Pelosi said, "I think there might be a need for an indictment." That's the backstory, that's the scandal. But what about the immediate problem? What's happening now to fix it? Well, we obviously need the administration to move formula where it needs to go. Open imports temporarily, move supply around the country while allowing WIC recipients to buy non-contract brands. Fortunately, that's all actually happening. The Biden administration used the Defense Production Act as well as military aircraft to import formula from Europe and move it around the country. The USDA is letting WIC recipients get non-Abbott formula. Abbott is cooperating. The Biden administration was late, months late, but their actions are now actually working. I think the shortage will dissipate at some point relatively soon. Now, on a broader level, though, what's important to recognize is that the shortage problem isn't just a baby formula crisis. We all remember nurses wearing garbage bags and ventilator shortages. We've had shortages of everything from ocean shipping containers to chlorine tablets to railroad capacity to black pipe to spicy chicken breasts to specialized plastic bags necessary for making vaccines. Shortages today, and this is true for 15 years, but it was accelerated by COVID, are common in America. Last Sunday, 60 Minutes did a piece on shortages of hundreds of pharmaceuticals in hospitals, basic pharmaceuticals, things like chemo drugs for kids, stuff that's not expensive. Now, this too is a story of power buyers handing out sole source contracts in return for rebates, which then fosters thinned out supply chains. In the case of these medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, the power buyer isn't the government, but a small number of corporations. In this case, they're called group purchasing organizations, and these are firms you've never heard of. They're like Vizient or Premier or Red Oak, who manage in aggregate $300 billion of hospital purchasing or generic pharmaceutical purchasing for those hospitals. Now, these power buyers, middlemen really, do the same thing the government does with baby formula. They hand out sole source contracts in return for rebates. Make a lot of money doing it too. But of course, this consolidates supply chains, so there's only one or two producers. That is what a sole source contract means. You are the only producer. The problem is, when there's a problem at the factory of a sole source producer making something, boom, you have a shortage. Shortages, in other words, are a monopoly problem. And this is accelerated when you're actually preying on those suppliers and charging lots of fees, because all of a sudden you don't necessarily have enough money to maintain your factory, and then you have safety issues, and then boom, the FDA is in there. And that's why we have hundreds of pharmaceuticals in shortage. Anyway, in the hearing on baby formula this week, FDA Commissioner Robert Califf brought up this 60 Minutes story several times. There are medical shortages across the board, he said, and noted that industry fought bitterly against the agency when it tried to get more visibility into supply chains. The monopolists, whether Abbott or whether Vizient, they know where their bread is buttered, and they want to keep their market power. Okay, so what do we need to do to end these shortages? Well, we have to take on the power buyers that run our economy using sole source contracts, market power, and rebates. It's not that hard to do. First, ban exclusive contracts and predatory rebates. Frankly, this is already in statute in the Clayton Act. It hasn't really been enforced, but it's in there. It could be enforced. In certain cases, like WIC or exemptions from anti-kickback rules for GPOs, Congress actually has to act statutorily. Second, break up power buyers wherever they are. Most of them are a result of mergers anyway. You can use antitrust law to do that, but Congress could help by strengthening antitrust law or merger law, or just going into specific sectors and breaking things up. Finally, pass a law, and this is probably a short-term fix that would do a lot of good. Pass a law that says that any life essential good, essentially anything regulated by the FDA, right, which is food and drugs, life essential, can't be sole source. No large buyer can purchase more than, say, 20 or 30% of its supply of any such commodity from any one supplier. That would immediately diversify supply chains, and it would mitigate shortages really quickly. Now, there needs to be some reform of the FDA as well, but the key here is to understand that the problem is in the market structure, in the monopolization. It's not just a regulatory issue. Now, here's the thing. These shortages are relatively new. They started in kind of the mid-2000s, 2004, 5, 6 or so, as monopolization gained steam. America didn't used to be a society with regular shortages of vital goods. And if you want some hope out of this situation, just remember, it doesn't have to be this way. Thanks for watching this big breakdown on the Breaking Points channel. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, you can sign up below for my market power focused newsletter, Big, in the description. Have a good one.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.